TrueNorthTV, powered by Communitech. From Waterloo region in Ontario, Canada to the world. The conversations you need and want to hear with interesting people on topics at the intersection of technology and humanity. Tech for good. Let's get started.
Thank you, Talia, and welcome to True North TV. Today we have our guest joining us from Boston, Massachusetts. It's Josh Lerner, and as many of you will know, Josh is a really big deal. And in fact, there's actually some groupies that are with us today who came to see Josh. He is a full professor at Harvard University. He's a global expert in venture capital. And he's got a real good sense as to, what the impact is on venture-backed businesses in economic downturns. Josh, thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. And thanks so much for the invitation to do this, Iain.
Tell us a bit about your background and how you came to focus on venture capital in your research.
Well, I perhaps have an unusual background for faculty at Harvard Business School in the sense that most of the time I spent between college and grad school was not spent in the business world, but rather down in Washington in the public sector. Most of the area that I stumbled into after school was almost immediately after graduation, was in this area of innovation policy. And at that time, you recall there was lots of worries about Japan as number one, and could we get our universities to spin new technologies off and so forth. And there were a variety of quite innovative policy initiatives that were done in the United States. There was the Bayh-Dole Act that basically allowed universities to more readily spin out technology, particularly to young firms. There was the Small Business Innovation Research Program, the SBIR program, that at the time was almost as large as the entire private venture capital industry and provided seed financing to a lot of interesting and promising businesses, and a whole range of other initiatives that tried to, essentially jumpstart the entrepreneurial economy. I was working out in Washington on a lot of this innovation policy issues, and I realized there was a big opportunity out there. We didn't really know how private actors like venture firms and entrepreneurs were really working. And I ended up coming up to Harvard under the tutelage of a fellow, Lou Branscombe, who ran an effort at the Kennedy School around many of these issues. And for some reason, have basically ended up staying here ever since.
Not a bad place to stay. Listen, you talk a lot about the importance of VC as a driver of innovation and why it's different and more important than more traditional sources of R&D. But can you kind of unpack that a bit for me?
Absolutely. One way to look at this is, if we look at the United States, in a typical year, venture capitalists will fund on the order of 0.5% of all businesses started in the US. It's just a tiny fraction. If you look on the other end of the thing at which companies go public, around 50% of the companies going public, of the entrepreneurial business going public, are venture-backed. So in a way, this seems to be incredibly high-powered money. Another way to look at it is to look at the most valuable companies in the world. If you look at the 8 most valuable companies in the world and you throw out the most valuable one, which is Saudi Aramco, essentially you've got all the 7 remaining ones, all of them were originally venture-backed. 5 of them from the US, which includes the usual suspects, and then Tencent and Alibaba from China. So essentially, the ability of venture capitalists to somehow be incredibly high-powered money and to convert ideas into these extremely valuable companies seems to be very striking.
I'm curious how much you know about the Canadian experience from a public policy perspective in trying to build a strong venture ecosystem. Have you spent much time looking at that?
Well, I have had a chance to spend a little bit of time both in terms of some of the public institutions like BDC, as well as with a couple of the provinces who have tried various initiatives along these lines. So I've had a bit of an exposure to, the history there, and obviously, as you say, there have been some, very good things that have happened, but a few bumps along the way as well.
Coming out of this pandemic, what do you see as far as the depth of the startups, the quality of the startups, the focus of the startups, or are there startups?
No, I think it's a great question as to how this is going to play out. In general, we know that one of the best times historically for venture industries is not before the world goes off a cliff, but after it goes off a cliff. And in particular, a few years after, it seems there's often less competition and the people are able to do better. At the same time, there clearly are some countervailing forces that can make it more challenging. And one of those is that it seems that after these downturns, one often sees what we sometimes would call a flight to safety. So in other words, if you're a name brand group sitting in Silicon Valley today, you're probably going to be able to raise money. You're probably going to have a long line of investors outside your door saying where to give you money. If, on the other hand, you're a first-time fund, particularly one sitting not in Silicon Valley, but sitting in Toronto or in Sydney, Australia, or Tokyo, it's going to be a much more challenging kind of process to raise money. And certainly, if you look at the experience of Canada, you look at the experience of Europe, Australia, after the 2000, for instance, dot-com crash, you see that there was a lot of experimentation and stuff that happened in the run-up to the financial crisis, to the dot-com crash. But then afterwards, it became very, very difficult to raise money. That in as much as people invested in venture capital, they said, let's go to the safe, the main places, the main brand funds, and put the money there. So I think there's both a positive side and a challenging side associated with these kinds of post-crisis periods.
And among the research that you've done, you point to the fact that there's a decrease in the quality and quantity of innovation during economic downturns. And I'm not sure whether we call ourselves an economic downturn. I'm not sure what we call ourselves. Yeah. Can you help us understand why that is? And is there a role for government in that to play from a stimulus perspective?
It's a really interesting question. So what we've done is look over the last 40 years at the recessions that have really popped up since the 1970s and asked the question of what happens to innovation during these periods. Now, we know in general, innovation tends to be cyclical. So, even big companies end up doing less patenting and less high quality patenting in these sort of recessionary periods. What we wanted to know is what happened to venture-backed innovation relative to the overall trends. And what we saw is that basically the venture guys essentially had very dramatic patterns, that during downturns they were just doing less patenting, less innovating, and particularly when you looked at the tail patents, the ones that were really influential and really shaped technology going forward, that those really dried up during these down periods. Now, the interesting question is why? One possibility might be people, right? That somebody ends up, somebody's working at Google, and in 2018 they say, I'm going to go spin out and start I might do a startup. In 2020, they're like, I've got a good job, I'm not going to go anywhere. And so there might be less availability of high quality entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial opportunities. The other possibility, though, is that there still might be good ideas out there, but people might be scared to finance them. And essentially, a lot of that reflects the dynamics of the venture market. We have these early stage investors who have relatively small funds and give a little money to people. And then the idea is that they build a bridge to a later stage investor who then provides the financing to go to the public markets or an acquisition. And the worry that I think we may see is that many early stage investors are like, we can build a bridge, but is this a bridge to nowhere, right? That if no one is going to basically pick up the financing and take it to the next level, I'm not willing to do this early stage investing because I'm ultimately dependent on the other guys stepping in and providing that follow-on financing. So to us, that seems like a very compelling argument for some of the dynamics we see, not just simply today potentially, but also in some of the earlier recessions.
Yeah, we talked a lot about startups. Are there implications in what we're going through right now for larger corporations, innovation strategies?
Well, I think that certainly one of the things that we've seen a lot of in the last few years has been this growth of interest in open innovation, corporate venturing, startup engagement programs. Choose your buzzword. These things have been everywhere. And unlike the 1990s, where it was the tech companies of the day, the Intels or the Dell computers who were doing it, today we see a much broader range of companies doing programs like this. The Kellogg cereal, the BMW, just a whole range of different industries trying these entrepreneurial kinds of activities on. One of the challenges that's been associated with these programs has been that they often have had issues when it's come to downturns like today's. And in particular, one saw a lot in 2001 and 2002 that companies that had very excitedly set up programs in 1998 and 1999 went and killed those programs. Even though it was probably a pretty good time to invest because there was a lot of companies who would be welcoming the money, they were either under financial pressures and were looking places to cut spending, or else there was sort of a bit of a faddishness that there was no longer all these headlines around venture and new venture activity and stuff. And the senior management were just like, let's go and spend our money somewhere else. So I think that there is a real story here where, it may well be that there's a tremendous opportunity, but the question will be, how much will the companies take advantage of it?
There was a recent article in MIT Technology Review. I know that's the other university, but they basically said that COVID-19 has blown apart the myth of Silicon Valley innovation and that America has lost the capacity to innovate.
It is interesting, right? I mean, in some sense, there has been a variety of literature or careful studies that have looked at patterns of innovation over time. And I think the element of truth is that ideas have become harder to find. So there's some fascinating work by Nick Bloom and his co-authors that have looked at a whole variety of technologies from drug discovery to semiconductors and made the point that to find a new drug, you got to work a lot harder than you did 30 years ago to get the improvement that Moore's law predicts. You've got to have many times more man hours or person hours to work at it and so forth. So, and certainly we know in terms of productivity, we haven't seen in the last decade the kind of growth that we did before in terms of productivity gains. So certainly saying that there are challenges with the innovation system, I would agree with. To see this as something that is, particular to the last 18 months or the last 3 months seems a little overstated. And certainly, I think one pattern that one does see going back to what we talked about before is that historically venture-backed firms have been far more innovative in terms of having more, punching above their weight, particularly when it comes to high-powered influential patents, which suggests that the story that it's just somehow all a myth or a sham seems a little bit misleading.
Yeah, I think the argument that they're making is that it's a long-term, and it started actually with a post that Mark Andreessen made, lamenting the fact that America had lost its capacity to innovate and was not prepared for a pandemic.
Certainly there is a sense that, innovation is not evenly distributed, right? That, we did a National Bureau of Economic Research conference in January. We looked at innovation across industries. And it was very striking how you have sectors like, for instance, the construction sector, where it seems like there's been almost no patenting, no real productivity gains to speak of, even though it's this huge sector of the economy. And I think it's fair to say that, there is a lot of, it certainly is the case that innovation is very unevenly distributed. And, certainly to some extent, you might say that reflects the fact that venture capitalists focus in on certain areas. Of course, one of the main reasons why they're focusing in on certain areas is because that's where they've been able to make money. If you look at an area like energy, I think the gross returns of energy-related investments over the last 25 years have been, essentially very close to zero. That's before fees for the venture capitalists. So it's not been an area where there's been a lot of hunger to go and do additional investments, even though clearly from a social perspective, there's a lot of benefits that we have from doing so.
There's an argument out there that says that globalization has really failed us, or global supply chains are not something we can rely on any longer with the behavior of the likes of China and America. How much do you think that there's going to be a public policy response to be focusing the attention of entrepreneurs on filling those gaps and ensuring that we have the capacity to be able to produce things like PPEs and a resilient supply chain of energy and food? Do you think that there's going to be a public sector influence on the kinds of companies, the areas of focus that the government's going to be asking entrepreneurs to pay attention to?
Well, certainly the government can play potentially an important role, right? We just think about procurement alone, that, the ability to sort of put their hand on the scale and say, we want companies based here or with these characteristics can potentially be quite substantial. How this will play out, I think there's still a lot of questions on. It could be that, the really big winners are the Mexican entrepreneurs in terms of or Eastern Europeans and so forth, that there will still be international supply chains, but shorter ones. It's still obviously very early going, and it's hard to really predict that.
In the last while, there's been a sort of a shadow or a stain on big tech. There's been some realization about some of the behavior of big tech and calling into question, do they need to be regulated? Do we, how do we address the issues around a small group of largely white males building things for the rest of the world? There's about 17 questions in there, Josh. I'll let you answer any one of them that you like.
Certainly, one thing that's more of a constant than we would think is that technology has ended up impacting society in unexpected ways. And that certainly we can think about a lot of inventions over the course of human history where the inventors were probably both pessimistic about the magnitude of the impact it would have and what the demand would be, and while simultaneously optimistic about the unambiguously positive effects that would be there, right? And certainly we could say automobile, and many other inventions could fall, telegraph, many other inventions could fall under these categories. And in that sense, you could say the most recent wave of internet innovations is no exception, that it basically, in the one hand, has had profound impacts that nobody saw probably going in, but also a whole variety of problematic behaviors have evolved that the creators and managers, perhaps reflecting their technological orientation, were not able to quickly pick up on, and they ended up mutating in a whole variety of different ways. It's not a, in some sense, new problem, but clearly given the sort of speed of diffusion and the power, the multiplicative nature of digitization, it's had a kind of profound effects in quite striking kind of ways.
You talked about the fact that there's a unequal or uneven distribution. Although we're seeing increasingly, Steve Case would say, with the rise of the rest, there's increasingly a more equal distribution of certainly talent and ideas across the country. I guess the question I have is, has the Silicon Valley had its day? There are people who are calling it sick and broken. When was the last real breakthrough technology company to come out of the Valley? What do you think about all that?
It's a fascinating set of questions. We are talking on Zoom, which certainly has had a profound impact on my last 4 months. So in that sense, it's an interesting matter for debate. I think that certainly it's interesting to speculate about what the geographic consequences of this is going to be, the whole crisis is going to be, and in particular, the sense that a lot of employers are now looking at least white collar knowledge worker employers are looking at their workforces and saying, we can do things in a quite different way. And you certainly can imagine that, were you working for an investment bank in New York City or a tech startup in San Francisco, as an employee, you might say, if I've suddenly got this freedom to live in Connecticut or Maine or Boise, Idaho, or whatever, even if they're going to trim my comp package by a little bit, there's going to be a trade-off in terms of quality of life and hassle factor and so forth. That's going to be something that I'm going to think about very seriously. And it does raise a whole set of really interesting questions. And in particular, if you suddenly have all of these, smart people distributed much more widely, perhaps Zooming, but what does it do to the geography of new firm formation and the innovation process? And I don't think we know the answer to that yet, but it certainly is some fascinating food for thought. I think this crisis is going to certainly keep academics busy for long after I've gone into emeritus status. We're going to be studying this and thinking through some of the implications.
In a world where we are all now, fully trained in, 6 versions of virtual conference, video conference, and it's become an accepted norm in all aspects of our lives, social, education, work, etc. What are the implications, and to what industries are there the fact that proximity is now optional? And so what does that mean for tier 3 universities? What does that mean for tier 1 universities? What does that mean for, as you say, firm formation? I was having an interesting conversation with a couple of young consultants from a large consulting firm in downtown Toronto who were both on in a 400 square foot apartment on the 33rd floor of a condo. And I was, of course, sending them pictures from the local real estate firm about what they could buy in the backyard they could have. And I think we're going to see a more equal distribution in capturing the economic potential of smaller cities with this need not to be in downtown X, Y, or Z.
To what extent will this be an exurban trend in terms of just simply people going and, saying I don't have to live in Boston, I can live on the, in Portland, Maine, or on the south coast of Maine? Or is it really going to be much more of a countrywide spread where you say, as long as I can get on a plane and be somewhere in 2 hours back at the office, I'm set. There's a lot of food for thought there. And I think in some sense, I'm pretty sure these changes would have happened anyway, but it seems like in a way, this has sort of really put the fast forward button on changes that would have manifested themselves in a couple decades, instead just being in a very short period of time.
I've been having a bunch of conversations with CEOs of the big banks and insurance companies and telecom companies in Canada recently, and of course, they're all talking about the fact that they've been able to achieve within weeks what they were unable to achieve within years. They're looking for the opportunity to be able to bottle that, to say, they're saying things like, well, how do we capture this ability to innovate, move quickly, be nimble, all the things we've been talking about with our innovation strategies for the years? How do we bake that into our DNA on a go-forward basis? You've got any recommendations or suggestions for them around that?
In some sense, we know, working from home is such a great example that, there's been study after study where, carefully designed studies with randomization and so forth, which show that people can be as productive or even more productive working from home. And yet, if you'd gone in February to the typical office in New York or Boston or Toronto, I'm sure 90% of the bosses you'd poll would say, oh, people are just going to goof around, they'll be in their pajamas, they're watching TV. No way, right? And I think that's sort of illustrative of how much of the barrier to innovation really isn't the technology itself. It's really much more about the attitudes that are around it, and how one really transforms those attitudes and creates that sort of crisis kind of atmosphere is a real magic, right? In some sense, you can say venture capitalists, by staging capital and saying you only have money for another 12 months and you better reach here or you're not going to get refinanced. In some sense, they're creating a artificial crisis, but they obviously are credible in the sense that a bunch of people don't get refunded, and it creates this sort of pressure to sort of think differently. Clearly when you're sitting in a large corporate or a government or university where things are chugging along, and in the case of Harvard, they've been chugging along for 375 years, doing pretty well. It's hard to imbue that kind of urgency in terms of we've got to change things without that sort of external pressure.
So you've been spending a lot of time, much of your life, looking at venture and venture capital. Tell me, do you have a couple of favorites as far as venture capitalists? Are there, a couple of ones which you point to and say, this is the way venture should operate. This person is the kind of person that exemplifies the way venture should operate, and why?
Well, that's obviously a tough question, and clearly the only safe answer is to name dead people on the grounds that no one can be mad at me because I'm restricting it to there. But I guess I admire a lot the people who essentially not just simply found interesting companies to innovate, but also who innovated in the model of doing things itself, right? And really said, how do we really think differently around this approach? I think, so one person I'd put in this list is somebody who just passed away very recently, Peter Brook, who many people regard as sort of the, with Advent International, really the sort of pioneer of the sort of global venture capital and later PE or growth capital firm as well. And if you think about what Peter did, is at a time when people were very local in terms of looking at things, said, how do we look much more globally? We've got a hammer here that doesn't just work in Boston or New York or San Francisco, and let's apply it much more broadly. We've got to innovate, and clearly there were challenges along that process, but I think that would be, sort of one person who had both the, not only a creative deals person, but also creative about the business of venture itself.
On a go-forward basis, when we look at sort of everything from Cambridge Analytica to, the stance and statements that CEOs of companies that begin with the letter F have made lately, do you think this next generation of entrepreneurs, do you think the VCs are going to be holding them to a higher level of account? Do you think we're going to start seeing some, tech for good values in baked into the way that founders operate and the kinds of things they build? Or is that going to be stuff that's going to come from the public pressure or consumers?
Clearly it's a mixed bag out there, right? And as one says, there's certainly lots of egregious behavior you can point to. You can say there's been a variety of people, sort of trying against the odds to do stuff in clean tech and other kinds of impact areas, and putting a lot of labor into it, even though it's the harder approach. But ultimately, I do think that this is, the most encouraging sign along these lines is the way in which many of the investors, the pools of capital, and I think whether you think about some of the European pensions, family offices in the Americas and so forth, are really trying to incorporate some of these considerations into their thinking. Because I think that ultimately, where the change really comes from is the push of the money to say you really got to incorporate not just simply some sort of box checking ESG considerations, but a more deep way of thinking about these issues into one's evaluations of companies and how one then deals with investors and entrepreneurs.
When you think about venture-backed entrepreneurs, do you have a favorite? Do you have someone you point to and just say, what a great entrepreneur?
No, that's too hard a question to answer. I really will get in trouble.
What else do you want to talk about?
It's a time where maybe if you've got a crystal ball, it's great. For those of us who are just running regressions and trying to figure the world out, it's clearly much harder to really figure out where we're going, just simply because, while one can see the changes in the past, there's so many discontinuities now that make it difficult to do those kinds of extrapolations. But I guess, it also is, at least from the perspective wearing my academic hat, it's also very, the challenge of really thinking through how one can, sort of see how this is going to play out and how one can formulate recommendations to governments around policies that may make sense to promote entrepreneurship in this very difficult environment is really quite fascinating at the same time. So really enjoyed having a chance to talk about some of these issues.
Well, I wanted to take the opportunity, first of all, to thank you for the recent decree that your president has issued to ban the H-1B visa so that we can repatriate all those great Canadians back home. He's really helping with our cause, and both from an innovation and from a venture perspective. So thank you for that, Josh.
Yes, I'm commenting on that one.
I wanted to take an opportunity to thank you, Josh, for spending time with us today. You are so highly regarded in so many fields, and I had the opportunity to meet with you and to participate in one of your sessions at the Quebec City Summit a number of years ago. And I didn't believe that a prof could, take a group of people who are all ADHD and hold them and on the edge of their seats for 3 hours. But it was one of the most remarkable experiences that I've ever had, and I thank you for that. So it's great to get some time with you. We'd love to have you back in the future, and one day we'd like to welcome you up to Canada to come and see some of the really interesting things that we're doing, not only around entrepreneurship, but also innovation.
Thank you so much for the chance to do this.
Wonderful. And I also wanted to thank everybody who tuned in to True North TV today. It was great to have you. And we're going to be back next Tuesday at noon.
Thanks for watching this episode of True North TV. Subscribe to Communitech's YouTube channel to get notified of future episodes of True North TV.